now we are on to the first lecture of the Global Citizen Lectures. How many of you are first-year students? Wow, not too bad. And how many of you are international students coming from abroad? Very good. Because as you know, this series of lectures that was initiated last year is targeted to the new students and to the international students in particular. However, these lectures are open, so we make note of the fact that some people in the audience, they seem to be, well, slightly older than the first-year students. But you are all welcome, and we are also very glad that some of our employees are present here today. Bernt Hagtvet has been bestowed the honor of opening this series. And I think most of you know already, just after a few days at the campus, that Bernt Hagtvet is one of our most distinguished researchers and lecturers. Bernt was willing to prepare for this lecture at a very short notice. You can all see what kind of books he had to go through during the preparation for the lecture. And I think we are in for a very, very interesting talk in a moment. Then, I think time has come simply to give the floor to you, Bernt. And as I said, we are extremely grateful that you have taken on this task on such a short notice. Bernt, the floor is yours. We are looking forward to your lecture.
Tack ska du ha. Good afternoon. When I was called upon to give this lecture, I asked Ole Petter, why in English? Norwegian, Ibsen's language, is the most beautiful language constructed. Even nynorsk could be used. Then Ole Petter said, this is for the first-year students, many of whom are international students. So English speakers must forgive my mutilation of Shakespeare's language. I'm sure that what I say, nevertheless, will be comprehensible. I have called my lecture The Responsibility of the University in an Age of Terrorism. Two questions will form the architecture of my remarks this afternoon. First, I shall discuss the vulnerability of the universities to outside pressures which run counter to the values of independent empirical research and intellectual honesty, the backbone of all universities, at least in democracies. Now, the second theme, which will run through my remarks, I want to analyze the relationship between the universities and constitutional democracy. More specifically, how universities can prepare a broader and a more deeper understanding of the moral and political foundations of democracy. This is a huge topic. I want to draw our attention to how the ideals of research, intellectual honesty, and free speech may contribute to a defense of democratic values and procedures, increasingly under pressure in today's globalizing world. In short, I shall discuss, to paraphrase Karl Popper, the open university and its enemies. So let me start by reminding all of you that universities are very vulnerable institutions, as is democracy. Ever since the first universities emerged in Bologna, Oxford, Salamanca in Spain in the early Middle Ages, the universities have remained the longest existing institutions in Western Europe. Only the Catholic Church can show a similarly uninterrupted lineage. But as you know, traditions in and by themselves are no guarantees of solidity or quality. To understand the roles of universities in relation to democracy in contemporary society, it is necessary to both to be realistic and remain anchored in the traditional strength of these venerable institutions, to strike a balance between tradition and innovation. This means that we shall have to move beyond the pious psalms singing the praises of university on festive occasions. Democracy, likewise, is easy to criticize, but not hard to defend. My aim here is to defend it against all forms of rationality and fundamentalism, and see it as the most valuable form of government because it institutionalizes uncertainty as a norm and makes human intelligence and freedom the bedrock of politics. How come? I shall in short offer defense of civil liberties and enlightenment values in an age of terror and growing obscurantism, or as the American philosopher Henry Frankfurter bluntly put it, in an age of encroaching bullshit, not least made more available through the social media. Now, to highlight these perspectives historically, let me start with an episode from my own student days. Power and consciousness in the 60s. On December 13, 1967, at the height of the Vietnam War, US Senator J. William Fulbright entered the following indictment of the American universities of his time into the congressional record. And I quote, "The failure of our universities at this point in time is to form a counterweight to the military-industrial complex by strengthening the emphasis on the traditional values of a democracy. Instead," he said, instead of doing that, they have joined the monolith, adding greatly to its power and influence. So you know, the military-industrial complex was a term coined by Eisenhower in 1960 on leaving office as American president. Specifically, Senator Fulbright referred to the failure of social scientists, my own kind of people, who ought to have acted as responsible and independent critics of the policies of government, but who instead have become the agents of the policies of this military-industrial juggernaut. While young Americans plead for resurrection of the American promise, their elders continue to subvert it, he said. With the surrender of independence, he continued, the neglect of teaching and the distortion of scholarship, the university is not only failing to meet its responsibilities to its students, it is betraying its public trust. As you may know, Senator Fulbright was a cosmopolitan in mind and practice, the architect of the famous Fulbright-Hays Act of Educational Exchange, offering stipends for students to come to the US and Americans to go abroad. He was at that time chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the USN. I met him personally in 1971. A great guy. At the same time, the Irish scholar and journalist Conor Cruise O'Brien, who later became the editor of the London Observer, observed that power in our time has more intelligence in its service and allows that intelligence more discretion as to its methods than ever before in history. Never before has the state has so much intelligence at its disposal. This development, O'Brien continued, is not altogether encouraging, since Western societies have moved towards a state of, quote, a society maimed through systematic corruption of its intelligence. This was at the height of the Vietnam War, when the American universities were accused of weapons industry and anti-terrorism, anti-counterinsurgency tactics in Latin America. It's a special time when the crisis of the university became critical. Implicitly, O'Brien called for new forms of vigilance in the scholarly community, not just defense of general academic principles, such as freedom of speech, integrity of research, freedom from politically engineered research, freedom to choose your field of study, as Max Weber said, Lehrfreiheit, and the publish your result and the right to participate in public discussions, even outright activism in defense of specific issues. No, O'Brien said, the intelligentsia should also be more aware of self-censorship, administrative intrusions into academic freedom, new forms of democracy, which will point to specific kinds of research as more important than others, or to use the current parlance to have more impact than other forms. And no least, every attempt to regiment the student body by compromising intellectual honesty through all forms of political correctness. So, censorship may not be solely a question of outer pressure. It may also be the result of inner pressure. That's O'Brien's main point. In fact, what these writers more than 40 years ago wanted to highlight was the corruption of intellect as a permanent threat in modern society. Power in our time has more intelligence in its service than ever before in history. we have a society maimed through systematic corruption of its intelligence, O'Brien wrote. More than 40 years have passed since these writers warned against the corruption of power, or to use Senator Fulbrights' classic title of the book, The Arrogance of Power. Later, the linguist Noam Chomsky followed up by coining the term mandarins of power, mandariner, after the Chinese term, mandarins of power. This term covered not only engineers in the weapons industry, but also their intellectual partners in the media and in the social science faculties. Chomsky pointed out the deep-seated tendencies which may account for the subversion of intellectual standards in American universities at that time. Particularly, he said, in the subfield of political science called international relations, a most dismal branch of US scholarship, as he put it. Chomsky's three tendencies were: first, a shared ideology of subservience to the state. Subservience, a lack of civil courage, a lack of civil disobedience, subservience to the state. Under the guise of raison d'etat, the state knows everything. Second, the attraction of being counted among the best and the brightest, the fascination with power, the longing for the invitation to come to Washington to serve as counselors to the Pentagon and the President. And thirdly, professionalization. That is separation of knowledge and broader views on the social utility and responsibility of your field of study. Narrowness of mind. Separately, my friends, these trends may not be that dangerous, but taken together they became a threat to the freedom of research, particularly so in a society which encourages specialization and stands in uncritical awe of technical expertise, Chomsky said of his native country. Now, the common argument of both Fulbright, O'Brien, and Chomsky was that the American involvement in the Vietnam War was designed and executed by these intellectual mandarins. Their idea of a university was to be subservient to the powers that be. The thirst for money had made the universities servants of power, the critical potential weakened, and the role as agents of social change more or less blunted. This amounted to a loss of public trust and a betrayal of the traditional calling of the universities. Student radicalism and the ambiguity of protest is my third point. Of course, there were protests. After all, we talk of the 60s, my youth. Students occupied university offices and shut down teaching. Some of you may have seen the now classic image of the leader of the Columbia Radicals in 1968, sitting in the office of the president, smoking his cigar, his feet on the president's desk, and defecating on his rug. In Wisconsin, radical students bombed a laboratory producing the chemical component in napalm. As you know, they used to defoil leaves of trees in Vietnam to make detection of Viet Cong easier, and leading to inherited diseases and great suffering. 4 people died in that attack. The Berkeley campus erupted in 1964 in protest against attempts by the university administration to curtail freedom of speech on campus. Harvard in 1970 was embroiled in huge demonstrations which caused substantial material damage in Cambridge. People died. I myself was in New Haven in 1970 when 4 students at Kent State were killed by the National Guard. The guard had run short of tear gas canisters, lost control, and resorted to sharp ammunition in desperation. They came to New Haven also, but had enough tear gas then to avoid shooting people. Protests against the war coalesced with the despair of persistence of racism in American life. At Yale, thousands of students protested against what was seen as violations of the rule of law, particularly when it applied to the blacks. The Black Panthers had murdered among themselves in the marches outside the city. The court started by gagging Bobby Seale, you may remember this, the leader of the Panthers, who had also been gagged in the famous trial Chicago 8 in the wake of the Democratic Convention in 1968. Again, we were overwhelmed by the feeling that blacks were denying justice, triggering nationwide demonstrations. In New Haven, Yale University came under fire as part of the establishment, although the university did not play an important role in arms industry. The paradox of means and ends. Again, there's a paradox. The criticism of university complicity in waging war and the protest against the military-industrial complex became in themselves authoritarian. and a threat to the integrity of university teachers. Evil cannot be fought with evil means, or what you combat with change, or the way you combat will change your methods. Wanting to create a new society, these people were willing to resort to extra-legal and violent tactics which defeated the purpose. Wanting to aid the poor in Colombia, the Columbia students ended up shutting down the university, potentially an instrument for alleviating poverty. I have devoted some time to this episode because they illustrate my main point, the vulnerability of the universities from all sides. The Columbia students wanted to halt Columbia's housing expansion in poor parts of Harlem, but turned violent in their campaign. In February 1974, Weatherman students belonging to the radical wing of the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, blew themselves up in the New York townhouse. They had been preparing bombs and were about to launch a rotamefaction-like campaign against the war. Classical case of extremism, classical case of polarization. Now, the totalitarian temptation then and now, the case of Norway. Today, the enemies of the open society and the open university are different. To give you a sense of the new frontiers of what people debate in today's world, I shall quote a few titles in the ever-growing literature on the future of liberal education and research. Indeed, what we see is a deep-seated cultural struggle about the meaning of higher education. The world has more universities than ever, yet we are increasingly skeptical about the quality and the value. I brought to you a little list of books on higher education in the United States, Britain, and indirectly in Norway. I had the pleasure of publishing a 4,000 or 1,000-page book on liberal education, Dannelse. Of course, this is a completely vain attempt. This country is not interested in Dannelse. But let me read. The Last Professors, the Corporate University and the Fate of the Humanities. Universities in the Marketplace, Derek Bock, Harvard President, The Commercialization of Higher Education. Classical title, University Incorporated, The Corporate Corruption of Higher Education. This is done for dramatic effect. Education's End, Why Our Colleges and Universities Have Given Up on the Meaning of Life. Even in the humanities, it is more important to discuss when that sentence went into a poem by W.H. Auden instead of discussing Auden's poem as an invitation to a discussion about the meaning of life. The intrusion of research methods in the humanities. Excellent book. We are trying to come to asking Anthony Krugman to come to Norway. We will not give up. The Good of the Place, Values and Challenges in Higher Education by Richard Broadhagen, now President of Duke. Crisis on Campus, a bold plan for reforming our colleges and universities. Not only are they discussing liberal education, they are also studying the cost of college, the huge cost of study. There are proposals to make colleges 3 years, as you know, in the United States. Now they are 4 years. Higher learning, Derek Bock, Harvard. The Three Cultures, Natural Science, Social Science, and Humanities in the 21st Century. Higher Education, the New Society. And ending up, just out, The Lost Soul of Higher Education. Corporatization, the assault on academic freedom, and the end of the American university. There's also a long list of books on the disappearance of intellectuals. You have no more intellectuals outside universities. Academics are writing for each other in impossible prose, inaccessible to anyone else. And this, of course, means the impoverishment of public debate. When you have no free-floating intellectuals, only academics, there will be a great loss to the public debate. So, if you look a few minutes to what happened in Norway, the grounds for criticism varied in Norway too when Ole Peter and I were young. In Norway in the 1960s, there was little discussion of the involvement of the universities in weapons research, basically because it never took place in the universities, it took place in independent corporations. But the American involvement in the war in Vietnam became a strong incentive for political radicalization and mobilization. This university, just outside, came under fire. Students, now several of them stayed professors and journalists from Oslo West, took over the rector's office, but it was more like a carnival-like affair than what went on in Colombia. It's great fun. I didn't have the courage to join. Substantial part of the radical left became Maoists, that is, admirers of Mao's China, similar despotism like Pol Pot's Cambodia, one of the deadliest regimes in human history. This may strike you, today's students, as slightly bizarre, but reminds us that danger from distorted forms of thought and political messianism, even in peaceful and crisis-free society like Norway, will continue to present a threat to the open university. This admiration for totalitarian dictatorships is very much like admiring today's North Korea. You may say this is absolutely bizarre, but I lived through it. Norway also had its share of political pilgrims going to Beijing, Tirana, and Phnom Penh to seek salvation for all ills at home. In 1968, just outside here, George Kennan, the famous American diplomat, stopped the student and said, what kind of society do your fellow students admire most? You know what he said? Albania. Albania. This says quite a lot of the tenor of the times. Interestingly, international conflicts like this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the mass killings in Syria and Egypt, and the war in Iraq, never triggered mass protests of the kind experienced in the 1960s. Why? Perhaps the reason can be found in the character of these tensions. They are less black and white and do not involve the US as the main culprit, as was the case in Vietnam 40 years ago. This makes mass action more difficult because the fronts are less comprehensible and less amenable to sloganeering. These Marxist-Leninists became dominant in the period from 1967 until the late 70s, but it would be wrong to say they paralyzed Norwegian universities. They were a nuisance for the majority with their incessant call for marked participation and public criticism, but they remain non-violent, rejecting calls from the Baader-Meinhof group to become a Nordic chapter. Now on the right, there were scattered acts of violence, a few intergroup murders, 1981, but no general flare-up of neo-Nazism. Norway had, after all, had its share of political right-wing utopianism during World War II. When a young black Norwegian, Benjamin Hermansen, was murdered outside Oslo in 2001, thousands showed up in public outrage. And of course, you all know of the case of Anders Behring Breivik, who in the most brutal act of right-wing terrorism since the war, killed 77 people in Oslo and at the Labour Party youth camp in Utøya. Now, the totalitarian temptation, how to combat it at the university. To my mind, the only way to combat totalitarian ideologies on the left and the right is to realize that the greatest danger to democracy and the integrity of the university comes from the seemingly magnetic force of all-encompassing ideologies, which simplify the external world and make choices one-dimensional and brutal action desirable and necessary. Totalitarian longings have a religious dimension, as you know, in a secular world with a repertoire of interpretations of the meaning of life, but also a widespread sense of void. These ideologies may offer tantalizingly rigid mental corsets which structure the world and impart individual meaning. Yet these longings should not be medicalized. The longings may come from mentally unstable minds, but the main point doesn't lie here. These inner demons, more generally, do not come from psychologically deranged individuals or from any inherent pathology of modern social structures. They come from thought. They are ideas, and ideas can be countered with other ideas. And here the university comes in. The universities are the prime movers in the war against tyrannies of mind. I believe that the close political and psychological analysis of existing totalitarian ideologies in their context, Stalinism, National Socialism, Fascism, Maoist, Islamist and Christian fundamentalism, may help us distinguish between different sorts of political messianism and perhaps enable us to predict the social, political, economic and cultural requisites for a resurgence of the seductive power of these romantic belief systems. Many young people, many of whom react against the ills of modernity, may become embraced by these ideologies. ideologies. Let us not forget how greatly such feelings contributed to the political horrors of the last century and just 2 years ago. The case of Breivik exemplifies this clearly. His image of the world is us versus them. He sees an imaginary Muslim threat to pure Europe, aligned with naive elites inside the gate and himself as a self-appointed knight. Breivik sees himself in a morally exceptional situation with the license to kill in the name of the good. This is the old story and the rationale behind unspeakable horrors, and they can come back. There seems to be a segment of the population always ready to embrace such ideologies. We are under no illusions, of course, Ole Petter Ottersen, that fanatical minds will ever be swayed by the university. Brigata Rossa terror group in Italy in the 70s consisted to a great part of university-educated people. The Maoist Shining Path cell in Peru was led by a university professor. Ulrike Meinhof had a degree in theology. In the Weimar Republic of the 30s, German universities became fertile grounds for Nazi recruitment and hotbeds of virulent anti-Semitism. At Yale, one of the colleges, Calhoun, is named after one of the most prominent protagonists of slavery in America. But rather than creating disillusions, these histories should prompt a profound rethinking of the role of the university in providing students the intellectual and moral tools for thinking about democratic values and institutions. Justification of democracy. So let us, by way of conclusion, friends, debate some of the justifications for democracy. Ah, what a boring topic. Democracy, good Lord. A yawning form of government, taken for granted, with its vulgar debates, its endless repercussions. Why democracy? Wow. But let's try to find the principled justifications for democracy. First and foremost, democracy, to my mind, in all its multifarious manifestations and different institutional settings, is the most likely to protect human freedom and human rights, and therefore give us the best potential for personal growth and self-determination. It gives us more room for moral autonomy than any other known system of government. Democracy is the only system of government that is wedded to intrinsic equality. In theory, all of the world is far from this in practice. Intrinsic equality means that the good or interest of each person should be given equal consideration. No inherited wealth, no professorial or bishopric position should give you a preeminence in discussion of public issues. Not even money has that power. Although, as you know, the United States is the best democracy money can buy. Democracy is the only system of government that is institutionally committed to the principle that it will change course in the light of new insights. That was the Achilles heel of the Soviet system. The only parts of the Soviet system which was amenable to change were the sciences, physics, mathematics, where freedom of speech was granted. But all the social sciences were desert-like, and the Soviet system was unable to take signals. More important, democracy is the only form of government that avoids humiliating the loser. This is because democracy offers the loser the prospect of winning the next election. Democracy is the best form of government to make power accountable, ansvarlig. Because decision-making processes are lodged ideally in rules of procedure and elections. To live in a country under laws of your own choosing, however distantly, facilitates the space for personal growth and the individual as a moral agent and a citizen. Because democracy is also based on self-interest, it is the best form of government which allows the people to stand up for their rights and interests. As John Stuart Mill said, let no one talk your interest. Represent your interest yourself. That's a huge democratic reform. The labor movement, of course, is a telling example of this. In democracy, you do not regard your fellow being a barrier on the path to truth, but a potential source of knowledge. It's a system based on people with low affect, compromise willing, who do not mean too much things too intensely. That's the reason why so many intellectuals are alien to democracy. Democracy doesn't give them the wings of history. the intensity of experience, the importance of their own opinions. Their own opinions are more or less the same as the farmer from Toten. Intellectuals have, on the whole, disbanded democracy. There are a few exceptions, Karl von Ossietzky, but on the whole, the intellectuals either go to the right or the left, become fascists or communists. Very few take a principled stand in favor of democracy, this boring alt-karakter form of government, whose civilizational values are lodged in Stortinget, not in philosophers, religious systems, or philosophies of history. That's the basic vulnerability of democracy from the intellectuals, people like me. It's a form of government, basically malleable, changeable system of provisional truth, foreløpige sannheter, that may be changed with changes of public opinion. Everybody can see today's world that this is an ideal far away from realization. Fanaticism and self-righteousness are the prime enemies of democracy. They are also the main protagonists of the Open University. So we can now conclude about the relationship between democracy and Open University in a sort of tentative way. The relationship between democracy and the universities first and foremost mean that the universities must never resign to being viewed merely as engines of economic growth, as the current thinking in Britain and the whole EU amounts to. The universities must protect the value of intellectual inquiry as something worth in and by itself, and as an important barrier against fanaticism. Respect for facts and close reasoning in succinct and clear language form the essence of a university education in all fields, the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. A university education must have a personal dimension in the sciences as well as in the humanities. It changes lives, it changes the personalities. If it doesn't do something else. The universities must remain cultural banks at the remove from the hurly-burly of daily politics, and yet firmly anchored in the defense of democratic pluralism and openness. This can only be done if the universities remain steadfast in their insistence on quality and close student-teacher supervision. University teaching should be a voyage of exploration with the students, not a cozy, challenging. I know this university may be far removed from these ideals, but we should never lose sight of the ideal. Because of the university's vulnerability to pressure from all its constituencies, government, students, faculty, parties, business, they hold a great potential for reform. Precisely because of this pressure, they hold a great potential for reform. They should be founded on a commitment which makes its relationship to any government inherently tense. I'm a closet anarchist. Any relationship to any government should be inherently tense and potentially subversive, no less in the US as in Norway. The test comes when the state is in crisis, when the luxury of tolerance is narrowed down or abolished, a state of affairs whose approximation the US came close to after 9/11. The crisis also is there when extremism offers the easy solutions, when they have all the answers for the true believers. By way of conclusion, I have decided to become true to myself. A Catholic cardinal, reactionary Catholic cardinal. In an age of relentless pressure, universities to have an impact in itself, a crude measure, more attuned to the business world and institutions of higher learning, we cannot do much wrong in reminding ourselves of what Cardinal Newman said in 1858 in his classic book, The Idea of University. To reject any idea of this kind in the name of utility would be an act of barbarism unheard of in earlier times. It is up to you, the younger generation, to embrace a deeper respect for this heritage and what is evident today. Now listen to the Cardinal, what he said more than 100 years ago. A university training is a great ordinary means to a great but ordinary end. It aims at raising the intellectual tone of society, at cultivating the public mind, at purifying the national taste, at supplying true principle to popular enthusiasm and fixed aims to popular aspiration, at giving enlargement and sobriety to the ideas of the age, at facilitating the exercise of political power and refining the intercourse of private life. It is education which gives a man a clear conscious view of his or her opinions and judgments, a truth in developing them, an eloquence in expressing them, and a force in urging them. It teaches him or her to see things as they are, to get right to the point, to disentangle a skein of thought, to detect what is sophisticated and to discard what is irrelevant. It prepares him or her to fill any post with credit and to master any subject with facility. It shows him or her how to accommodate himself or herself to others, how to throw himself or herself into the state of mind, how to understand their point of view, how to bring before them his own, how to influence them, how to come to an understanding with them, how to bear with them. He is at home in any society. He has common grounds in every class. He knows when to speak and when to be silent. He is able to converse. He is able to listen. He can ask a question pertinently and gain a lesson seasonably. When he has nothing to impart himself, he is ever ready, yet never in the way. He is a pleasant companion and a comrade you can depend on. He or she knows when to be serious and when to trifle, and he has a sure tact which enables him to trifle with gracefulness and to become serious with effect. Welcome to the University of Oslo. Good luck.
So, Bernt, as director of the university, I must say that I'm very grateful to your views when it comes to your views of the university. And I noticed that you used the integrity of the university in the same sentence as the word democracy several times. So what you have conveyed to you, I think, is a very clear message that to uphold democracy, it is essential that universities remain as they are, to a certain extent anyway, autonomous institutions that can speak truth to power.
That's true.
So this is at least one very strong message that I think Bernt successfully conveys to you. You refer to John Henry Newman, and he spent his life reflecting upon what is a university. And he said in one passage that we didn't quote that university is a place for collision between minds, where minds collide with minds. And this is where we are now, because now what we want to see is a debate, questions and responses.
Perhaps I should add that not only is the relationship between democracy and universities seen from the external side, but I would also argue the importance of democracy inside university. For example, the fact that you are elected and not appointed is important. The fact that we still can elect our heads, our institute secretaries, is very important for the legitimacy of the rules of governance in the university. But it will, of course, depend upon the discipline of the students. If they vote, if they take part in the discussions, as Willy Brandt says, you should venture more democracy. Våg mer demokrati.
So it took quite some efforts to achieve the rights that we have today. Now it takes strength, efforts, and commitment to preserve them. So, the questions. Please feel free to ask questions.
I just wonder why you changed your title from The Menace of Terrorism to In the Age of Terrorism, or your subtitle.
I had forgotten the original one.
Okay. I just want you to elaborate or reflect on the notion of the age of terrorism, because a menace of terrorism is the possible threat of terrorism. If you say it is an age of terrorism, then you say that is the major threat in our time and the major threat to democracy. And one might argue the opposite, that a security-driven policy, a security-driven politics and industry could be considered the major threat to democracy in our time. So I just wanted to reflect on that choice of subtitle, please.
I do not attach any profound meaning to the change of words. I've been working day and night the last 4 days. I simply have forgotten the title. But I would say to your question, terrorism will of course never lead to the downfall of democratic government. And it can lead to nuisance. People will die, but of course no government in Western Europe, or not even in China, India, or Latin American countries, will be brought down by terrorism. So the question is, how much freedom shall we sacrifice in the defense of security? And Benjamin Franklin said it. The ones, we already said, the ones who sacrifice freedom in the search of security doesn't deserve security and will have nothing. So I think this is a question of courage. In Britain, there's a long debate about the detention hour. Now it's 72 hours of detention in the home country of Magna Carta and the 1688 revolution. They can keep people under control. And a few days ago, British agents came and destroyed PCs in The Guardian. What a fascinating time we live in. The United States government has allowed 2 small people access to secrets from underneath. And these people say, wow, the government is betraying the trust. It's a fascinating ambivalence we are going to. Of course the government must indict them, but I must, since I have no secrets with you, I admire Manning and Snowden. I admire them. This is important because it shows the ease with which huge surveillance system can be penetrated. Wow, I liked it. Don't tell anyone.
Hello, my name is Jonas Iverson. I'm a master student. I'm wondering, how far should the university go as having political opinions? We had a debate about whether the security service here, the G4S, would be here or not.
When I was in the United States, I remember the Nobel Prize-winning biologist Shockley, who says that blacks are less intelligent than whites. When he came to campus, there was a huge demonstration against him, but the university administration made a point of protecting his freedom of speech. Now I ask Ole Petter, suppose there would be a fanatical anti-Semite coming to the campus, insisting to give a lecture to the students on the nature of the Jewish threat. What would you do?
Well, I thought the question should be directed to you.
I think I would defend his or her access to the students, because the students would take care of him.
But that's the essential issue, because I think that what you expose and what we should expose is the view that if we have a setting where thoughts can be countered by other thoughts, like here, where there is a room for debate, then things hopefully will correct themselves. What is dangerous is that if this professor comes into this auditorium, gives his speech and then runs away, then it might become dangerous. So that's why this exchange of responses and questions are so important. Don't you agree?
I agree. In the 1930s, Nasjonal Samling tried to take over Studentersamfunnet, the student union, which at that time was an important institution. Mot Dag, the Norwegian radical left, simply argued them away. And then they went out into the Gymnassamfunn, and they took out the fight against Nasjonal Samling, and that's the only way to do it. To meet him in open landscape and discuss with them, and I'm sure that the students would
where minds collide with minds.
Minds collide with minds.
What I feel now, the Scandinavian countries like the only real freedom countries, and it seems less countries are still free because they become involved into debts and some losses of people mind and so on. And the problem is that it seems like it's like Scandinavian countries in the world, and it's very hard to be like a small island in all ocean. So how do you think where it leads, and what is the future of Norway and the other global world countries?
Well, I would say I think this country with its huge wealth should be more generous in relation to Greece, Italy, Portugal. You can say they have more or less, they have themselves to blame. But we act in relation to these countries with our huge masses of money in a very brutal way. And there's no public discussion of whether or not we should perhaps give them longer payback times and simply show ourselves pro-European by behaving differently with our oil fund. That's one question. Speaking about Norwegian culture, I would say it's quite resilient. I think it depends what you mean by culture. I think we should defend our language. We should not see a contradiction between English speaking and Norwegian speaking, but we should defend our language, and we should defend the Nynorsk language. And we should do it vibrantly and forcefully, and which will force the students to be able to write better. I see a gradual decline in the ability to write in this country. I think we should be very concerned about the quality of the media. I think we should be very critical of the social media. To my mind, it's not an elaboration of democracy. And in general, I think that the high quality of Norwegian education on the whole will prepare this nation to face the globalizing world. I hope so. I think I'm quite optimistic, but I may be naive. It's up to you. You're 20, I'm 67.
You mentioned that you were a closet anarchist, and that
Yes.
and that you believe there should always be a tension between the people and the government. Surely, don't you think having a democracy, the best possible path for that is so you get rid of that tension between the people and the government, and that the ideal situation of a democracy is that it creates a society where there is no tension between the people and the government?
There should be tension. You remember Oxford University didn't give Margaret Thatcher an honorary degree. The first time in modern history the Prime Minister has not been given an honorary degree because the scientists wanted to punish her. She had cut the funds to the sciences. By tension, I mean not war. I mean fruitful give and take between the government and the universities. You know, Ole Petter every autumn has his articles, his meetings with the government ministers, complaining about the lack of funds and also complaining, I would say, the lack of interest on the part of the government in higher education. I wonder why the government dared to treat the higher education the way they have done. More than 200,000 young people are now in the system. How could they dare? And so few people vote social left parties, partly due to the fact that the Minister of Education, Djupedal, really gave us a blow many, many years ago. So there must be always a tension. And what do you do, for example, when the government attacks Libya, okay, on the basis of a UN declaration, but perhaps then the action widens. Of course the university should arrange debates on that. About research on immigration, there should always be a tension between the university and the government, simply because the universities have a different role to perform. Universities are wedded to the pursuit of truth and knowledge. The government is wedded to the pursuit of power and policies. And this tension is part of democracy and is good.
Could I add to that,
Yes.
if you permit?
I always
Because
permit
for
you.
the foreign students, for international students, I should tell you that in the ethical guidelines for our government and for our nation state, it's explicitly stated that we have an academic freedom that extends so far as to say the following thing. Research data should be published even if they run counter to the government's policies. This is stated explicitly in the guidelines. So we are in fact as an institution invited to be critical of the government and of the institution. And I think that the only way to safeguard the quality of our institutions is to criticize them. And that's our responsibility. And we are not good enough at it, I dare say.
In the US, there's another kind of tension between big business and people who give money. Let me give you an example. At Yale 10 years ago, I think the Bass family gave a huge sum of money. That was a time when there was discussion about the origins of Western civilization, the Black Athena, Aristotle was black and so on, multiculturalism. And they gave $400 million or something to this new program of the roots of Western civilization. And the president never said, thank you, very good. But when the family started to try to control the selection of faculty, they gave all the money back. That's independence.
I think, Bernt, that this session has come to an end, and we are very grateful that you, the students, came here today and that you asked questions. We hope this will not be the last time, because this is also an important, let's put it this way, an important ingredient of democracy, that we have this arena for discussions and debates. An applause for Bernt.
Thank you.